We are going to look at personality from 6 different approaches this semester. And for the most part, these are not competing approaches. They each have different foci instead, so different focus points. And I want you to be familiar with those today. So let's go over the first one here, the psychodynamic approach. Tell me this, do you think that your personality is affected or can be affected by things of which you are not aware? And if you're thinking, yeah, I think so, you are right. And that is the focus of the psychodynamic approach. You can write down these 2 words, unconscious influences. Okay, so the psychodynamic approach is going to focus on unconscious influences. Now, the trait approach, okay, is going to focus on trait dimensions. And, you know, we all haven't always had knowledge of personality traits. Researchers haven't. And, this idea of measuring them and comparing people on them, and that is what this approach is about. So when we say trait dimension, we're talking about a trait continuum. It could be any trait. It could be like extroverted. You put it on a dimension, on a continuum. We're talking scores from 0 to whatever, or 1 to whatever. Okay, so it might be 0 to 100. And measuring people and finding out where they land on this dimension, and then finding out if where they land on the dimension helps to predict different behaviors. Okay, so a very cool approach, and we're going to look at some really cool research coming out of that approach. Trait dimensions is the focus. The biological approach has 2 different foci. Okay, and so let me ask you this. To what extent do you think that your personality is inherited from your biological parents? And you might be surprised by the answer about how much it really is. Okay, so there's 2 different foci to the biological approach, and the first one is genetics, and the second one is physiology. Okay, to what extent is your personality, your physiology in your body affected by your personality? So the 2 different foci under the biological approach are genetics and physiology. Now the humanistic approach, watch my pointer here, you're going to see this word embedded in here, human. Okay, that's going to help you remember what this approach is all about. 2 foci again. And both of them focusing on that idea of being human. The first one is the positive side of human nature. Okay, and you're going to notice as we go through the other approaches that oftentimes there's kind of a emphasis on some things that can go wrong in personality. So the humanistic psychologists are saying, no, we want to study exceptionally healthy people, exceptionally mentally healthy, really exceptional personalities, the positive side of human nature. Okay, and the second one focus here is free will. That is something that is unique to human beings, unique to the human species. Okay, we're the only species that has free will. Okay, and that plays into changing your personality. So if you don't like something about it, humanistic psychologists would say you have the power to do something about it. And you might say, well, wait a minute. You just got done telling us that personality is durable over a lifetime. Okay, and that is true as far as the range. So if you're like medium high in extroversion, okay, you're going to be that way the rest of your life. But, you could think about extroversion on the trait dimension, and you could think about where you land on it as parentheses around that point. Okay, and there are different things that can make it jump around within those parentheses. And using your free will, you can move as long as it's within that range, within those parentheses. And you might say, well, that's not very much. But we're going to look at how even a little bit of movement there that you do purposely, can make a significant difference in the quality of your life. Humanistic approach, the 2 foci being the positive side of human nature and free will. Okay. Now, the social behavioral approach, sometimes it's abbreviated and just called the behavioral approach. But remember, it entails both. And the focus here, if you know anything about the behaviorists, okay, you will not be surprised to know that the focus here is learned, observable behavior. So this is, when we say learned, we're kind of looking at the flip side of that biological coin, right? Remember that we look at the biological approach there, part of that was genetics. So how much of your personality is inherited and how much do you learn after you enter this world? And so the social behavioral approach will look at learned observable behavior. So the behaviors have this unique way of looking at psychology where they're at personality, because they're actually looking at the output of personality behavior, studying it through looking at that output. And also, again, if you know anything, if you've learned anything about the behaviorists, you won't be surprised to know that they like to focus on observable behavior. Okay. And then finally, we've got the cognitive approach. And what does that mean, cognitive? And many of you know that this means thought processes. Okay. So how does your personality affect the way that you think? How does your personality affect your thought processes? And again, some very cool research that we're going to look at under that approach. Now, you did your reading assignment for today, and you probably noticed in your reading assignment that these words seem to be used interchangeably. Personality test, sometimes they would say personality test, but sometimes they would call it a personality assessment, same thing. Sometimes they call it a personality measure, using the word measure as a noun. Okay, so personality measure to mean personality test, or a personality instrument, or a personality scale. Okay, and so these words are used interchangeably, and they mean the same thing. We're going to talk here a moment about personality tests. How is it that, we test personality, and how do we know when we have a good personality test? There's a lot of pseudo-psychology in the world. In other words, people claiming something is psychology when it really is not. Okay, and this certainly applies to personality tests. So let me think of a magazine. There are a lot of magazines, like Cosmopolitan magazine seems to have what they call a personality test in every single issue, a different one. But these tests are not personality tests. We're going to learn the difference here today, what a test has to go through in order to be accepted and recommended and endorsed by the American Psychological Association as a personality test, in order to be proven to be valid and reliable and put out there on the market with the APA stamp of approval to use this in research, a real personality test. So the ones that we see like in Cosmopolitan magazine, they just hire somebody to think of these and write them up every day. What do people like to read? What do they like to find out about themselves and others? Let's make this stuff up. This is very different. This is a real science when we talk about real personality tests. We also see a lot of fake ones on dating sites. Okay, so we're surrounded by these fake personality tests, but we want to learn about the real thing. So let me give you a hypothetical situation. I want you to imagine that as a class, okay, we want to come up with a real personality test, maybe for what would be interesting. Let's say open-mindedness. Okay, there's a really interesting personality trait, and this is one, let's say, that we want to come up with a personality test for. Well, we've already talked about in the intro to this class, in policies, we talked about your assignment, the NEO assignment, or the big five, I might say, assignment, okay, that you're going to be doing. And um, how expensive that is, that the authors actually get this copyright royalty every single time that this test is administered. And so when you do this assignment, you're giving it to yourself, you're giving it to someone else. For each one of you in the class, those authors are getting 2 different royalties. And multiply that by all of the classes, personality classes, across the country, and all of the personality psychologists that are administering this to their clients. And you can see that usually people who come up with a really good test that is APA endorsed at the end, okay, and on the market and popular, live in very big houses, right? So let's say we want to come up as a class with a personality test for open-mindedness. Now, the first thing that we need to do is to construct our test. And then we're going to have to prove that our test is valid and it is reliable. And when we say valid, what we mean is, does it measure what we claim that it measures? We're trying to claim it's going to measure open-mindedness. Is that really what it's measuring? Okay. And when we say reliable, have you ever felt like you take a test and you get a certain score on it and you think, I would have scored really differently if I would have taken this a week ago, or if I took this, a month later or a year later, if I take this in the future, I would score differently on it. And yeah, of course, you're going to be in a different mood. You might answer things a little bit differently. We wouldn't expect, if you took this test again, a personality test again, that you would get the exact same number score. Okay. However, remember that personality is durable over a lifetime. So if our test really measures what it claims to measure, and it is a personality trait, okay, then what's going to happen is you're going to still be in the same range. So remember those parentheses we talked about. If you think about open-mindedness on a trait dimension from 0 to 50 or whatever, right? And if you're in the, let's say, medium-low range, okay, you can think about your point on that dimension surrounded by parentheses, okay, and your score is going to jump around a little bit, but it can't jump around outside of those parentheses or it's not reliable. It's not a reliable measurement. It's not a reliable test. So, when we talk about physical things and reliable measurements, if I took a ruler and I measured this pen today and I measured it again tomorrow and a year from now and so on, using the same ruler, I would come up with exactly the same measurement, right? But when we talk about abstract things like personality, okay, then we can measure them. We can use a tool like a test, but instead of the exact score, it is reliable, that stays within that range over a lifetime. Okay, so we're going to have to show that our test is valid and that it is reliable. And the first validity test that we need to do on this is involved in the construction of the test itself. And it's called content validity. Content validity. And in your book, I think they call it face validity. Either way, I want you to be familiar with both terms because they are used interchangeably too, and they mean the same thing. So when they say face, they're saying, oh, on the face of it, is it intuitively valid? Is it really measuring what it's supposed to measure? Just intuitively. Okay, so content validity is just a does it make sense test. But that's a really good starting point, right? I mean, it better make sense before you go on. So let's think about what we would do if, as a class, we came up with this open-mindedness test. One thing we might do is have, hypothetically, is have every student in the class send in 3 proposed questions for our test. Okay. Now, the next thing we need to do is come up with a committee from the class to work on deciding which of these proposed questions are going to be part of our scale or our measure or our assessment or our test. right? Remember those words? So we need to come up with a committee, and we really want to be wise about this, okay? This is part of what will make or break whether our test gets accepted by APA and endorsed and put on the market, and whether it becomes popular or not. One of the things that will affect it is how we chose our committee. So let's say that, we might say, well, to start with, we will go by overall GPA, okay? And someone else might say, well, what about honors students? That kind of puts that into perspective. So we might say, okay, if we have, 12 or more honors students in the class, we can start with them. But we're also going to look at overall GPA, because some people might not, for instance, have the finances to be part of the honors school here, but they might still have a really high GPA. Okay, so let's say we go by overall GPA, and we take the highest GPAs in the class. Maybe out of a couple hundred students, we take the 25 highest GPAs, and then we look at psychology GPA. Okay, that might be a good one. And then we look even further at, and we specify all these different criteria at the number of psychology classes somebody has taken and the grades they got in those classes. Okay. But all of these things are setting the parameters for our committee. Who's going to decide which of these proposed questions get put into our scale? Now, I want you to look closely at this slide. It says tests of validity. We're focused on the first one. You'll see that there are 3 of them in all. There's also going to be 2 tests of reliability. And a lot of you are familiar with APA style research papers. And the paper that we need to submit at the end, after we've, if we want to actually submit our test to be considered, through APA, then it's going to be a 5-study paper. So a lot of you are familiar with the idea of these journal articles in psychology, and they might be 1 study, but they might be, some of them are 2, some are 3, some are 4, some are even 6 or 7, and sometimes that really can get carried away, right? But it's not always just 1 study, and in fact, this is a huge project, okay? And if we finish it and submit it, it's going to be 5 studies in all. And the first one is going to be content validity. And so we write up content validity all the way, okay, from the methods all the way to the discussion conclusion at the end. Okay, so we have to describe in detail how we selected our committee, and then the process that the committee went through. Did they vote on this? How many votes? Did it have to be unanimous, or was it a majority, or did it have to be 2/3 voting yes to get a question in? And so again, the committee's going to vote based on their feelings of common sense on each of our questions. Let's say the committee looks at the first question, and that question reads like this. All of these questions, a similar, a very common personality measurement test is, for each of these items, rate it 1 to 7, how best it describes you, from not at all to very much, okay? So let's say the first one they open and read is this. I enjoy trying different ethnic foods, okay? Now, I want you to think about this, okay? I want you to think about if you were eavesdropping, or you were on this committee, or eavesdropping on the discussion around this item. You might hear somebody say, well, I don't think that really captures the idea of open-mindedness. And somebody else might say, well, it certainly doesn't capture the entire concept, but it captures a tiny piece of the pie. And we need to capture, with all of our questions, as many pieces of that pie as we can, right? And there's probably a lot of pieces of the pie, but being open to trying new foods from other cultures would be one valid slice of the pie. And it's a small slice, which means somebody could score low on that particular item, but still score high on others enough to get a high score in open-mindedness, right? But anyway, you could hear this discussion going on, you can imagine it, and the committee, decides, yes, this is a valid item, this is great, we're keeping it, it's going to be an item on our scale. They open the second one up, okay? And that one says, I really enjoyed traveling and exploring other countries and peoples. And they go through the same kind of discussion. They know it's only one tiny piece of the pie, but it is a piece of the pie, and they accept it, okay? And they open up a third one, and it says, I am most comfortable if my phone number is not listed, okay? And they do a final vote on this one. So far, they've got 100% because of the discussion. They came to a consensus on the first two. 100% yeses, and this one, 100% no. Dump it, right? But, it's going to go, what they're going to do is try to capture as many pieces, slices of that pie, of what we would think of as open-mindedness as a whole, okay, as they can. And that entire process, any of you have read a methods section of a journal paper in psychology, it is extremely detailed, right? It's not exactly pleasure reading, but it's very important. And you want to impress, the reviewers with that you really went through a valid process here in content validity and putting the scale together. And so you rewrite up that entire paper all the way from methods to the very end, results and discussion conclusions at the end. And that's just the first study of the paper, right? Now we have to do what is called the second test of validity, that is called construct validity. Construct validity, okay? Now, in your book, this is called congruent validity and sometimes discriminant validity. You're like, oh, too many names. But these are used interchangeably. And for instance, if you're going on to grad school, you never know which one of these might show up on the GRE, the Graduate Record Examination for entry into grad school. But I do want you to be familiar with these different terms: congruent validity, congruent/discriminant validity, and construct validity, used interchangeably. Well, construct validity is really interesting. What this is about is, we're going to answer this question with this test. Does our test for open-mindedness correlate with things it should correlate with? And does it not correlate with things it shouldn't correlate with? So remember, correlational research is looking for a relationship, right? So is it related to things it should be related to? And is it not related to things it shouldn't be related to? Okay? These are going to be correlational studies. There's going to be a number of them reported in this study. Okay, a number of correlational measures in this study. So first, we're going to come up with some ideas, maybe 3 ideas of things that should be correlated with. So one example, for instance, could be bigotry. So do you think open-mindedness is related to bigotry? Yeah, what kind of relationship is that? Positive or negative? What would you expect? Yeah, it's going to be a negative relationship. In other words, if we know their scores on one, it helps us to predict their scores on the other. If they're high on one, they tend to be low on the other, right? So if they're high on open-mindedness, they tend to be low on bigotry. If they're high on bigotry, they tend to be low on open-mindedness. They're related. Hey, they should be related. So what we do is we get 100, let's say we get 100 participants in our study, and we give them our open-mindedness test, and then we give them what is called kind of an underground measure of bigotry. In other words, we don't want to ask them if they're bigoted or use a self-report measure, right? But we do want to get an honest measure of whether they're bigoted. And there's measures for this that are kind of undercover. And so there's a test called the IAT, for instance, that measures this without people knowing. And so let's say we have them take our test, and then we have them take the IAT, and for each one we have their 2 scores. We can see if they're correlated. We can see if we get that negative relationship. Now, if it's a perfect negative relationship, okay, then something's wrong. We don't have a unique test here. In fact, we're probably not measuring open-mindedness. We're probably measuring just bigotry, right? When we say bigotry should be related to it, bigotry should be a slice of the pie, but not the whole thing. Otherwise, we haven't contributed anything new to the market because we could use a test of bigotry, right? But we would want it to be a reasonably high correlation because, I mean, they are correlated. So it should be a reasonable or mediocre correlation there. So let's say we come up with 3 things that should be correlated with. We do that kind of correlational study on all 3, and we show that, yes, we've got, mediocre strength correlations in all 3. And we write all that up. That's great. We also have to show not just congruent, watch my pointer here, but not just congruent, but also discriminant validity. Okay, so we have to come up with some things that it shouldn't be correlated with at all, and run those correlational studies and show that there was no correlation. In other words, that the correlation coefficient was close to 0. Okay. Now, you might notice that we write up that whole study. Now we have 2 studies in our paper. We're not done. There's going to be 5, right? This is a pretty major project. Again, unlike those little personality tests that they claim are personality tests on dating internet sites and in magazines and such. And you might notice that there's a 3rd validity test here, but that's usually done last. So we're actually going to come back to this slide. We're going to move on to reliability. A really simple idea. Okay, if our participants take the test now and then they take it later, will their scores still be in the same range? Okay, so will their scores, if somebody scores low, they're still going to be low. It's not going to be the exact score, but it's still going to be low. Or if they're medium high, it's still going to be medium high, right? So very simple logic and a great name. You'll remember this: test, retest. So this is the first test of reliability. Test, retest. So we've given all of our participants the test already from the prior construct validity study we did. Okay, and we can use their scores on that, but what we need to do now is to wait and give it to them. Maybe we give it to them, let's say 6 months later and a year later, okay? And then we report those test, retest scores and the correlation, okay? And you want that correlation has got to come out high because they've got to still be within that same range. And let's say we get that. Okay, so everything's going our way. This looks great. And we get great correlations on their test retest scores. And the next test of reliability is an interesting one. This is where you split the test randomly. So you can have the computer take their scores, just the first time you gave them the test, put those scores into the computer and for their answers for each item, okay? And then have the computer for each participant randomly select half of the items in the test, half of our questions, and compute the score for that half of the test, and then the other half of the items, and compute the score for that half of the test, and then correlate their scores on the 2 different halves, okay? And again, if it's a reliable measure, okay, they should both be in the same range. Okay, so another simple idea, split test reliability, but that's an entire paper with all this data and analyses again reported, an entire study within our paper. Okay, so now we've got 4 studies all written up. We have 1 more to go. And so we'll go back to this previous slide, and we're looking at predictive validity. This one comes last. It's really interesting because if our open-mindedness test did not predict different behaviors, what good would it be, right? I mean, if it doesn't predict different behaviors for people who are low scorers and high scorers, then it's going to be of no use. We need to show that it can predict a behavior. And as you can imagine, there's so many different behaviors that would be part of this pie of behaviors related to the idea of open-mindedness. So we already talked about some, like exploring different cultures and trying different ethnic foods. And, another one would be like listening to different music from different cultures, or it might be uh, being curious and listening carefully to others' viewpoints that differ from your own, and so on and so forth. And anyway, so we need to come up with a good test of predictive validity. And so if we can think of one really good one, that's all we need to show, okay, to move on here. So let's say that we come up with the idea of testing bigotry in a real life situation. Okay, there's a interesting way we could do this. We already have our 100 participants. We have their scores from a prior thing we did. We invite them back in. We know their score on this, but we invite them back in for another study. And let's say that they arrive just one at a time. They think there's one other person in the waiting room, and they assume it's another subject, another participant in the study, but actually somebody who's working for us. We call that a confederate. Somebody who's working for the researcher and is posed to look like a participant student in the study. Okay, so they're asked to wait in a waiting room. We're not quite ready for them yet. They come into this waiting room in a typical waiting room with chairs all the way around in a circle, right? And straight across about that halfway point in the circle, we've got a person sitting there who is obviously of a different ethnicity than our participant is, okay? And let's say that what we measure is how many seats away from this person they sit. Now, first off, do you think that if somebody was highly bigoted, they would tend to sit further away than somebody who wasn't bigoted at all? Okay, usually that's the case, right? So there should be a relationship here. And so this would be a valid way of looking at predictive validity. So let's say tell me this, do you think anybody at all is going to sit in one of those seats on either side directly next to our participant? No, that's kind of against social norms, right? So people usually sit one seat over as long as there's room for it. Okay, so our scores, are going to be probably starting with a second seat over in each direction, and that would be like a 1, and the next seat with 2, and next seat's out a 3, and the next seat's out a 4, and the next seat's out a 5, and so on, right? So that would be their bigotry score. And then, we can let them go. We can, or we can pretend it was a study about something else at that point, give them another measure, and then debrief from afterward. But we already know what we want to know once they sit in their seat in the waiting room, right? And so now for each participant, we've got their score on our open-mindedness test, and we also have a score for them for bigotry, and we see if they're correlated, okay? And if there's a relationship there, then we're going to get a correlation. And let's say that we get a nice, moderately strong correlation there. And very respectable one. Now we write up that 5th paper all the way through methods, or 5th study in the paper, all the way from methods to the discussion at the end. And now we're done with our paper. Okay, but now we're only at the beginning of a process that is called peer review. Some of you are familiar with this process, a lot of you may not be. Here's the deal: when you write a study or a paper and you want to get it published in psychology, you need to send it to an APA journal editor. So you find a journal that's appropriate. We could go to personality testing, for instance, would be very appropriate. We send it to the editor of the journal. The editor then usually contacts like 6 different reviewers who are experts, 6 different people, not just within the United States, okay, but across the globe, 6 people who are experts, not just in the area of personality testing, but also in this whole concept of open-mindedness. So expert psychologists in this area. And the editor sends them each a copy of our paper. They don't know who the other ones are. They do not talk to each other. They don't even know who each other are. So they're working independently, and they review our paper in great detail. From each of them, we're going to get back, probably anywhere from 3 to 6 pages, single-spaced letter, reviewing our paper and critiquing it, and every aspect of it. The editor is going to make the final decision because they're all going to be making recommendations. Then the editor is going to, if we're really lucky, send us a revise and resubmit letter saying that we are inviting you to revise your paper according to the expert's suggestions and resubmit it. Okay. Usually that's the best you get. So almost never is a paper just accepted outright. I mean, think about this. You're getting the benefit of having these expert opinions come in and contribute to and make your paper even better before publishing. Okay, now it could be flat out rejected, but let's say we get lucky and we get a revise and resubmit. Now we're going to go through each of the editor's ideas, okay, and suggestions, and revise our paper. And if we're lucky, there will be some little things in there like, the literature review where we talk about at the beginning of a paper how we know what we know so far. In other words, what's open-mindedness about? We got to describe that in our paper, and we have to talk about people who've studied that concept and what they found. The lit review is a citation in talking about, discussing, and citing many different other studies that were done before then in this area. And so if we're really lucky, some of the suggestions will be really easy, like, I think so-and-so paper is really valid to your lit review and should be included in the discussion. Well, that's easy. You can write that in, right? Some of them are going to be more cumbersome. So you might have a reviewer who says, I don't like the way you did the statistics on this one. There's a tighter way of doing it. And so I want you to reanalyze using different stats on this particular study, the analyses you did. Okay, or you might get something that's really, really cumbersome where you have to make a decision. Do you want to start all over or not? Because the reviewers might pretty much agree that you really should have worked with 200 subjects instead of 100, right? But the bottom line is, if we, if we look at all their suggestions and we revise the paper using these to make it much stronger, and we resubmit it, and if we're really lucky, then it will be accepted for publication, for APA stamp of approval. Our test will go on the market, and like I said, we can live in some very big houses.